Right now, at this very moment, someone is watching a house. They're not just glancing at it as they walk by. They're studying it, cataloging patterns, noting vulnerabilities, and making calculations about risk versus reward. The house they're watching might be yours, and the terrifying truth is that you probably have no idea they're there. Most people believe that home invasions, harassment, and property crimes are random acts committed by opportunistic criminals who simply got lucky. But the reality is far more disturbing and far more calculated than most people realize. Over the next hour, we're going to explore something that law enforcement, security experts, and criminal psychologists understand, but that the average person never learns until it's too late. We're going to examine the psychology of predatory behavior targeting homes and residents, how criminals select their victims, what patterns they look for, and most importantly, what psychological and behavioral factors make certain people and properties attractive targets while others are passed over entirely. This isn't just about physical security measures like locks and cameras, though we'll discuss those. This is about understanding the predator's mind, recognizing the invisible signals you might be broadcasting that mark you as a target, and learning how to fundamentally change the risk calculation that determines whether you become a victim. The stories of home invasion, stalking, and property harassment that circulate online, and that many of us have heard, share common elements that aren't coincidental. Young residents, newly moved into properties, unclear boundaries with neighbors or adjacent properties, visible vulnerability, and a specific pattern of escalation that follows a predictable psychological progression. Understanding these patterns isn't about creating paranoia or fear. It's about recognizing that predatory behavior follows rules, operates according to psychological principles, and can be disrupted if you understand how it works. We'll examine the psychology of territorial transgression and why certain properties invite boundary violations. We'll explore the concept of victim selection and what criminals are actually looking for when they choose targets. We'll discuss the escalation pattern that almost all harassment and invasion scenarios follow, and why recognizing early warning signs is critical. We'll analyze the psychology of intimidation and what harassers are trying to accomplish through their behavior. And we'll provide a comprehensive framework for assessing your own vulnerability and implementing changes that fundamentally alter the risk equation. By the end of this exploration, you'll understand not just how to make your home more secure, but how to present yourself and your property in ways that cause predators to unconsciously eliminate you from consideration as a potential target. Part 1. The psychology of target selection. Let's start with the most fundamental and uncomfortable truth about predatory behavior targeting homes and residents. It's not random. Criminals, harassers, and predators of all types engage in a process that professionals call target selection. And this process is far more sophisticated and psychologically informed than most people realize. Understanding how target selection works is the first step toward ensuring you're not selected. The target selection process begins with what's called environmental scanning. This is when a potential criminal surveys an area looking for properties and residents that meet certain criteria. They're not just walking around aimlessly hopping to stumble onto an opportunity. They're actively looking for specific signals and indicators that suggest a property or resident will be vulnerable, profitable, or unlikely to mount effective resistance. This scanning process is both conscious and unconscious, meaning that experienced criminals have internalized these assessment criteria to the point where they can evaluate a potential target almost instantly based on pattern recognition. The first major category of selection criteria is perceived vulnerability. This operates at multiple levels, from the physical security of the property to the perceived vulnerability of the residents themselves. Physical vulnerability includes obvious factors like lack of fencing, poor lighting, obscured sight lines where someone could approach without being seen, lack of security systems or cameras, and physical access points that appear easy to breach. but it also includes more subtle factors like signs of neglect or disrepair that suggest the residents either can't afford or don't prioritize property maintenance and security. Resident vulnerability is assessed through a different set of signals. Age and physical capability of residents, whether determined through direct observation or inference from other factors like vehicles, outdoor equipment, or other belongings visible from the street. Gender composition of the household, with properties occupied solely by women being statistically targeted at higher rates, not because women are actually less capable of defending themselves, but because many criminals operate under the assumption that they are. Household size, and whether the property appears to be occupied by a single person, a couple, or a larger family group. Social isolation indicators such as whether the residents appear to have regular visitors, strong connections to neighbors, or support networks that would notice if something went wrong. The second major category of selection criteria is reward potential. Criminals are making cost-benefit calculations, whether consciously or instinctively, and the potential reward from targeting a particular property or resident factors heavily into whether they proceed. Reward potential is assessed through visible indicators of wealth or valuable property. Vehicles parked at the residence, visible electronics or equipment, quality of the home and its maintenance, and presence of items that suggest disposable income. But reward potential isn't just about financial gain. For harassers and stalkers who aren't primarily motivated by theft, the reward is psychological. It's the sense of power, control, and impact they can have on their target. The third category, and this one is critical, is perceived risk. Every criminal or harasser is making an assessment of how likely they are to be caught, confronted, or face consequences for their actions. Properties and residents that are perceived as high risk, meaning there's a good chance the perpetrator will face negative consequences, are systematically avoided in favor of lower risk targets. Risk assessment includes factors like visible security measures such as cameras, alarm systems, and security signage. However, the mere presence of these measures isn't what matters. It's whether they appear to be genuine and functional or just for show. Criminals can often tell the difference. Evidence of awareness and vigilance on the part of residents is another risk factor. Do the residents appear to pay attention to their surroundings? Do they vary their routines or follow predictable patterns? Do they notice when things are out of place? Signs of social connection and community integration matter because criminals understand that residents who are well known to their neighbors and integrated into the community are higher risk targets. If something happens, people will notice, people will care, and people will get involved. Social isolation creates low-risk targeting opportunities. The fourth category of selection criteria is accessibility. How easy is it to access the property, observe it, and escape if necessary? Properties that are isolated from neighbors, that have multiple access points, that have poor sight lines making surveillance difficult, or that are adjacent to abandoned or poorly maintained properties are assessed as more accessible. But accessibility isn't just physical. It's also about social and legal accessibility. Is the property in an area where police response is slow? Are there boundary ambiguities that could be exploited? Are there opportunities to establish presence or create confusion about who has legitimate access to the area? Now, here's where understanding target selection becomes practically useful. The same property can present entirely differently based on relatively minor changes in how it's maintained, how residents behave, and what signals are being broadcast. A house that looks like a high-value, low-risk, easy-access target to a criminal can be transformed into a property that gets passed over through strategic changes that alter the selection equation. This isn't about turning your home into a fortress or living in a state of paranoid hypervigilance. It's about understanding what signals you're currently sending and making conscious choices about what you want to communicate. The psychological principle at work here is called rational choice theory in criminology. It proposes that criminals make decisions based on a rational assessment of costs, benefits, and risks. While not all criminal behavior is perfectly rational, especially when influenced by substances, desperation, or mental illness, most predatory behavior targeting homes follows predictable patterns based on these calculations. The criminals who are most dangerous, the ones who are methodical, experienced, and successful, are the ones who are most systematic in their target selection. These are exactly the criminals you most want to deter, and deterrence works by changing their cost-benefit calculation. Another critical aspect of target selection that often gets overlooked is the role of opportunity exploitation. Criminals are looking for specific opportunities that arise from particular circumstances. Moving into a new property, as we see in many harassment scenarios, creates a window of opportunity. The residents are unknown quantities to the neighborhood. Their patterns and routines aren't established. Their support networks in the area are weak or non-existent. Security measures may not be fully implemented yet. Belongings are visible during the moving process. There's general chaos and distraction that reduces awareness. All of these factors create what security professionals call a high vulnerability period that many criminals specifically target. Understanding that target selection is a process, not a random event, fundamentally changes how you think about home security and personal safety. You're not trying to prevent all possible crimes or protect against all possible threats. That's impossible and would require turning your home into a prison. Instead, you're trying to ensure that when a criminal or harasser is conducting their selection process, they assess your property and person as higher risk, lower reward, more difficult, and less vulnerable than alternative targets in the area. You're not trying to become invulnerable. You're trying to become less attractive as a target than your neighbors, which sounds cold but is the reality of how selection works. Part 2. The pattern of escalation. Once a target has been selected, predatory behavior almost always follows a predictable pattern of escalation. Understanding this pattern is critical because it provides opportunities for intervention at each stage before the situation reaches crisis levels. The escalation pattern exists because predators, whether they're criminals, harassers, or stalkers, are testing boundaries, assessing responses, and building confidence in their ability to act without consequences. The first stage of escalation is what security professionals call probing or testing. This is when the predator makes initial contact or intrusion that's ambiguous enough to have plausible deniability, but that allows them to gauge the target's awareness and response. In property contexts, probing might look like walking through your yard or garden area as if taking a shortcut, approaching your door under some pretense, being visible in locations where they're watching your property, or engaging in minor boundary violations that aren't clearly criminal but that test whether you notice and respond. The psychological purpose of probing is twofold. First, it allows the predator to assess your vigilance and responsiveness. Do you notice when someone is on your property? Do you confront boundary violations? Do you report suspicious activity? Second, it allows them to normalize their presence. By being visible in and around your property during this probing phase, they're training you to see them as part of the environment rather than as a threat. This is a sophisticated psychological manipulation that makes later escalation less likely to trigger alarm because you've become habituated to their presence. The target's response during the probing phase is absolutely critical in determining whether the situation escalates or de-escalates. A strong, clear response that establishes boundaries, demonstrates awareness, and signals that violations will have consequences often causes predators to abandon the target and move on to someone who appears more vulnerable. A weak response, no response, or a response that suggests fear, confusion, or inability to establish boundaries encourages escalation. This is why understanding what's happening during the probing phase is so important. It's your best opportunity to disrupt the escalation pattern. The second stage of escalation is establishing presence or creating boundary ambiguity. Once the predator has determined through probing that the target is viable, they begin to establish more regular presence in or around the property, and to create situations where their access or presence becomes normalized, or where boundaries become unclear. This might manifest as using adjacent property to access areas near your home, appearing regularly at times when they can observe your routines, creating pretexts for interaction or observation, or exploiting any existing boundary ambiguities such as shared spaces, unclear property lines, or abandoned adjacent properties. The psychological objective of this stage is to make their presence seem normal or even legitimate while simultaneously gathering information about your patterns, routines, vulnerabilities, and responses. They're building a detailed profile of when you're home, when you're away, what your typical behaviors are, how you respond to various situations, and what your support network looks like. This intelligence gathering is methodical and purposeful. They're preparing for later stages of escalation by understanding exactly when and how to act to maximize success and minimize risk. This stage often involves what psychologists call gaslighting or reality distortion, where the predator creates situations that make you question your own perceptions, or that make you feel like you're overreacting to normal behavior. They might use shared spaces in ways that are technically permissible, but that feel intrusive. They might be visible at odd hours, but not doing anything overtly threatening. They might create situations where confronting them would seem like an overreaction to anyone who doesn't understand the pattern. This is psychologically sophisticated manipulation, designed to prevent effective response during the critical window when escalation could still be easily disrupted. The third stage of escalation is overt intimidation or harassment. Once the predator has established presence, gathered intelligence, and assessed that the target is unlikely to mount effective resistance, they begin engaging in behaviors that are clearly intended to frighten, intimidate, or demonstrate power. This is the stage where behavior shifts from ambiguous to obviously threatening, though it may still stop short of clearly criminal acts. Intimidation behaviors include direct starring or observation, approaching the property at unusual hours, testing doors or windows, making threatening gestures or statements, displaying objects or engaging in behaviors meant to frighten, or creating situations that demonstrate their knowledge of your routines or private information. The psychological purpose of intimidation is to create fear and helplessness, while still maintaining some degree of plausible deniability, or while staying just below the threshold of what law enforcement will actively address. Predators understand that many intimidation tactics are difficult to prosecute, even when they're clearly intended to frighten. Standing on a public street staring at someone's house, while creepy and threatening, often doesn't meet the legal standard for harassment or stalking. Testing door handles might be explained as confusion or accident. This legal and enforcement gray area is deliberately exploited by sophisticated predators who know exactly how far they can push before crossing lines that will result in consequences. The target's psychological response during the intimidation stage often includes fear, naturally, but also confusion about whether they're overreacting, isolation if they feel like others don't take the situation seriously, helplessness if law enforcement seems unable or unwilling to intervene effectively, and sometimes normalization where the ongoing intimidation becomes part of daily life rather than triggering continued alarm and defensive responses. All of these responses benefit the predator and facilitate further escalation. The fourth stage, and this is where situations become acutely dangerous, is direct action or completion of the intended crime. This is when the predator moves from intimidation and preparation to actually carrying out whatever action they've been building toward, whether that's home invasion, theft, assault, or continued harassment at levels that cause serious psychological damage. The transition to this stage isn't random. It typically occurs when the predator has assessed that resistance will be minimal, that the window of opportunity is optimal, that they've adequately prepared and planned, and that the risks are acceptable given the expected reward. Understanding this escalation pattern has practical implications for prevention and intervention. First, recognizing that you're in the probing stage allows you to respond strongly and establish boundaries before the situation progresses. Many people make the mistake of not responding to early boundary violations because they seem minor or because they don't want to seem paranoid or unfriendly. But strong responses during the probing stage are your most effective tool for preventing escalation. Second, understanding that presence and boundary establishment precedes actual harmful action means that you shouldn't wait until behavior becomes overtly threatening before taking protective action. By the time intimidation begins, you're already in the later stages of escalation, and your options for easy intervention have passed. Third, recognizing the pattern allows you to document systematically and build a case with law enforcement even when individual incidents seem minor. The pattern is the crime, not necessarily each individual act. Law enforcement may not be able to act on one incident of someone walking through your garden, but they can potentially act on a documented pattern of repeated boundary violations, especially when you can articulate that it appears to be systematic testing and escalation. Fourth, understanding escalation helps you avoid the psychological traps that predators rely on, particularly the gaslighting and reality distortion that makes you question whether you're overreacting. Trust the pattern, not individual incidents. If someone's behavior toward you or your property is following this escalation curve, your concern is justified regardless of whether any single incident seems criminal. Part 3. The psychology of intimidation and control. To effectively protect yourself and disrupt predatory behavior, you need to understand what predators are actually trying to accomplish through intimidation and harassment. It's not always about immediate criminal action. Often, the intimidation itself is the goal, or it serves psychological purposes that enable later action. Understanding these psychological dynamics helps you respond more effectively. The first psychological objective of intimidation is establishing dominance and control over the target's psychological state and behavior. Predators who engage in systematic harassment and intimidation are trying to make you afraid, to make you change your behavior in response to that fear, and to demonstrate that they have power over your emotional state and daily life. This is particularly true in scenarios involving stalking or targeted harassment, where the primary motivation isn't financial gain but psychological gratification, derived from having impact on another person's life. The mechanism by which intimidation establishes control is through creating a state of hypervigilance and anxiety in the target. When you're being systematically intimidated, you begin scanning your environment constantly for signs of the threat. You start interpreting ambiguous stimuli as potentially dangerous. Your baseline anxiety increases. Your sleep quality decreases. Your sense of safety and security in your own home is undermined. All of these effects serve the intimidator's psychological needs by demonstrating their power to affect you and by making you behave in ways that acknowledge their presence and impact. For predators whose ultimate goal is criminal action like theft or home invasion, intimidation serves a different but related purpose. It's about ensuring compliance and reducing resistance when they do act. A target who has been systematically intimidated and who has learned through that process that the predator is persistent, that law enforcement doesn't or won't help, and that resistance is futile, is far less likely to resist effectively when the actual crime occurs. The intimidation period is essentially training the victim to be an ideal victim, someone who is too frightened and demoralized to mount effective resistance. The second psychological objective of intimidation is isolating the target socially and psychologically. Predators understand that targets with strong social support networks and community connections are higher risk because intervention from others is more likely. Therefore, systematic intimidation often includes elements designed to make the target feel isolated, to make them reluctant to seek help, because they fear not being believed or being seen as overreacting, and to create divisions between the target and potential sources of support. This isolation is accomplished through several mechanisms. First, by engaging in behavior that's ambiguous or that falls into legal gray areas, the intimidator creates situations where the target feels foolish or paranoid when explaining what's happening to others. When you tell someone that a person stood outside your house staring for 30 minutes, but didn't do anything illegal, didn't approach, didn't threaten, just stood there, you often feel like you sound crazy or like you're overreacting. This feeling inhibits help-seeking behavior, even though the behavior you're describing is clearly part of a concerning pattern. Second, intimidation that continues despite the target's attempts to get help from law enforcement or other authorities creates learned helplessness, a psychological state where the person stops trying to get help because previous attempts were ineffective. When police tell you repeatedly that there's nothing they can do because no crime has been committed, when they make you feel like you're wasting their time or overreacting, you stop calling them. This learned helplessness serves the predator's interests perfectly by removing institutional obstacles to their continued behavior. Third, the stress and psychological distress caused by ongoing intimidation can strain relationships and social connections. You become preoccupied with the threat, possibly irritable or anxious in ways that affect your interactions with others, potentially difficult to be around because of your heightened stress state. This natural response to being under threat can unfortunately have the effect of pushing away potential sources of support, further isolating you and making you more vulnerable. The third psychological objective of intimidation is reality testing and power demonstration. Predators engage in intimidation partly to test the reality of their power and control, to verify that they can act without consequences, and to experience the psychological gratification that comes from successfully intimidating another person. This is particularly true for predators whose primary motivation is psychological rather than instrumental. They're not necessarily building up to theft or assault. The intimidation itself provides the psychological reward they're seeking. This power demonstration aspect explains why intimidation behavior often seems performative or theatrical. The masked figure standing in front of your property in a cross pose, harassers who make sure you see them watching you, people who engage in behavior designed to be maximally frightening rather than maximally effective for accomplishing some other goal. All of these behaviors suggest that the display of power is itself the objective. Understanding this helps clarify why certain predators are so persistent even when their behavior attracts attention and creates risk. They're not trying to avoid detection. They're trying to maximize psychological impact. The fourth psychological objective is conditioning and normalization. Predators who engage in extended intimidation campaigns are training you to accept their presence and behavior as part of your normal reality. Each incident that occurs without effective intervention or consequences normalizes the behavior slightly. Each time you have to adjust your life to accommodate the threat, you're being trained to accept the fundamental premise that this person has power over you and your environment. Over time, what would have seemed outrageous and unacceptable at the beginning becomes your new normal. This normalization serves multiple purposes for the predator. It reduces the likelihood that you'll continue fighting or seeking help because you've learned that such efforts are ineffective. It creates a psychological environment where escalation can occur gradually without triggering the kind of alarm and resistance that sudden dramatic escalation would trigger. And it demonstrates the predator's ability to reshape your reality, which provides psychological gratification for control-oriented predators. Understanding these psychological objectives helps frame effective responses to intimidation. First, refusing to modify your behavior in response to intimidation, to the extent that's safely possible, denies the predator the gratification they're seeking from establishing control over you. This doesn't mean being reckless. but it means making conscious choices about which behavioral changes are necessary for safety versus which are capitulations to intimidation. Second, maintaining and strengthening social connections despite the tendency toward isolation is critical. This might mean being very explicit with supportive friends and family about what's happening and asking them to stay connected even if you're difficult to be around. It might mean forcing yourself to stay engaged with community and neighbors even when you feel vulnerable about having them know what's happening. Third, systematic documentation of all incidents creates a record that helps combat the gaslighting and reality distortion that intimidation relies on. When you have dates, times, descriptions, photographs, and video of incidents, it's harder for others to dismiss what's happening and harder for you to doubt your own perceptions. Fourth, understanding that the intimidation itself is often the primary goal rather than a prelude to something else helps calibrate your response. You're not waiting for the other shoe to drop. The intimidation is the assault, responding to it as a serious threat rather than as preliminary behavior is appropriate. Part 4. Vulnerability factors and risk assessment. Let's examine the specific factors that increase vulnerability to predatory behavior targeting homes and residents. Understanding your own vulnerability profile helps you identify areas where protective measures will have the greatest impact and helps you recognize when you're in elevated risk situations that warrant heightened awareness and precaution. The first major vulnerability factor is environmental isolation. This operates on multiple dimensions. Physical isolation means your property is distant from neighbors, has poor sight lines, is adjacent to abandoned or poorly maintained properties, or is in areas with slow law enforcement response times. Social isolation means you lack strong connections to neighbors and community. You don't have people who would notice if something was wrong. Your support network is distant or weak, or you're new to the area without established relationships. Temporal isolation means there are regular periods when you're alone in the property without others nearby, when the neighborhood is generally unpopulated or inactive, or when your patterns of presence and absence are highly predictable. Environmental isolation is often compounded by structural factors like being located on a corner lot or at the end of a street where there's only one neighboring property, having multiple access points to your property, including from adjacent properties or alleyways, having vegetation or structures that obscure sight lines and observation, or being in areas where there's high turnover in neighboring properties, creating lack of stable community presence. Understanding your level of environmental isolation helps you prioritize countermeasures. High isolation properties require more active security measures because passive security through community awareness and observation is limited. The second major vulnerability factor is demographic characteristics that correlate with targeting. We need to be direct about this even though it's uncomfortable. Women living alone or women living together without male residents are statistically targeted at higher rates for certain types of crimes and harassment. Young people, particularly those in their 20s, are assessed as less threatening and less likely to have established support networks and resources. Elderly individuals are perceived as physically vulnerable and less capable of resistance. People who are visibly different from the surrounding community in terms of race, ethnicity, religion, or other identity factors may be targeted by bias-motivated criminals or may be assessed as socially isolated and less likely to have community support. None of this is fair and none of it should be true. But understanding that these demographic factors influence target selection by some predators allows people in these categories to be more aware of elevated risk and to implement compensatory protective measures. It's also important to recognize that demographic vulnerability is often about perception and assumption rather than actual vulnerability. A household of women may be just as capable of defending itself as a mixed-gender household, but it may be targeted more frequently because criminals operate on faulty assumptions. Therefore, Part of effective protection is actively contradicting those assumptions through behavior and visible security measures. The third major vulnerability factor is boundary ambiguity and territorial confusion. Properties that have unclear boundaries, disputed access rights, shared spaces that aren't clearly delineated, or adjacency to abandoned or multi-user properties create opportunities for predators to establish presence and normalize their access while maintaining plausible deniability about whether they're actually trespassing or violating boundaries. Criminals deliberately seek out these situations because they provide cover for surveillance, testing, and even initial stages of action. Boundary ambiguity is particularly exploited during the early stages of target selection and escalation. A predator can walk through a shared garden area or poorly defined property line, can observe from adjacent abandoned property, can use confusion about who has legitimate access to areas near your home to justify their presence if confronted. This ambiguity serves their purposes by making you uncertain about whether you're justified in objecting to their presence, and by making intervention by law enforcement or others difficult, because it's unclear whether any rules or laws are actually being violated. The fourth major vulnerability factor is visible indicators of limited resources or capability. Properties that show signs of neglect, disrepair, or inability to maintain basic security measures send signals about the resident's resources and capabilities. Broken fences that aren't repaired, non-functional security equipment that's left in place, poor lighting that's not addressed, overgrown vegetation that creates cover for approach. All of these visible indicators suggest to predators that the residents either can't afford or can't implement effective security measures, which reduces perceived risk. This doesn't mean that people who are economically disadvantaged are to blame for being targeted. The issue is that visible signs of limited resources factor into predatory risk calculations. Understanding this allows for prioritization of what limited resources are available toward measures that have maximum deterrent effect, which often aren't the most expensive measures, but rather those that signal capability and awareness. The fifth vulnerability factor is behavioral patterns that broadcast predictability and create windows of opportunity. Highly regular routines with predictable absences from the property, visible loading and unloading of valuables, public sharing of travel plans or absence from home on social media, leaving certain doors or windows consistently accessible, and generally living in ways that provide detailed intelligence about your patterns to anyone who's observing all create opportunities for predation. The psychological principle at work here is that predators are looking for low-risk opportunities, and predictability creates those opportunities. If someone knows exactly when you leave for work, exactly how long you're typically gone, exactly which entrance you use, and exactly when you return, they can plan criminal activity with high confidence in avoiding detection or confrontation. Unpredictability is itself a security measure, because it increases the risk to the predator that you'll be present when they don't expect you, or that your patterns will differ from their observations. The sixth vulnerability factor, and this one is critical but often overlooked, is psychological and behavioral response patterns that signal lack of awareness, capability, or willingness to resist. How you respond to minor boundary violations, whether you notice suspicious activity, how you carry yourself and present yourself, and how you handle confrontation all send signals about whether you're an easy or difficult target. Predators are skilled at reading these signals, often unconsciously based on experience. Response patterns that signal vulnerability include not noticing or not responding to minor boundary violations, appearing fearful or uncertain when confronting suspicious behavior, broadcasting distress or helplessness in response to intimidation, publicly discussing feeling unsafe or victimized in ways that confirm predators' power, and generally behaving in ways that suggest you won't or can't mount effective resistance. This doesn't mean you need to be aggressive or confrontational, but it does mean that projecting awareness, confidence, and capability has protective value, even if that's not how you actually feel internally. Creating a personal vulnerability assessment involves honestly evaluating yourself against these factors. Which of these vulnerability factors apply to your situation? Which can you change or mitigate? Which are fixed factors that require compensatory measures? The goal isn't to achieve zero vulnerability, which is impossible. The goal is to understand your risk profile well enough to implement targeted protective measures that have maximum impact on your actual areas of vulnerability, rather than spending resources on generic security measures that may not address your specific risk factors. Part 5. The reality of law enforcement response. We need to have an honest conversation about law enforcement response to property harassment, intimidation, and pre-crime behavior. Understanding the limitations, constraints, and priorities of law enforcement helps you have realistic expectations, communicate more effectively with police when you need to involve them, and avoid the learned helplessness and frustration that comes from expecting things that the system isn't designed or able to provide. The first reality to understand is that law enforcement is primarily reactive rather than proactive. Police respond to crimes that have occurred or that are in progress. They're generally not resourced or authorized to provide ongoing protection against potential future crimes, to intervene in situations where no law has clearly been broken, or to act based on patterns of behavior that are concerning but not clearly criminal. This isn't a criticism of police. It's a structural reality of how law enforcement operates in most jurisdictions. This reactive orientation creates a fundamental mismatch with the needs of people experiencing the kind of escalating harassment and intimidation we've been discussing. The pattern is the threat, but each individual incident may not constitute a clear crime. The early stages of escalation, probing and establishing presence, often don't involve any illegal activity at all. Even overt intimidation, while clearly intended to frighten, may not meet legal thresholds for harassment or stalking, depending on specific jurisdiction and circumstances. Understanding this mismatch helps you communicate more effectively with law enforcement. Instead of reporting individual ambiguous incidents and expecting immediate action, you document patterns and present the pattern as the issue. Instead of expecting police to prevent something that might happen, you focus on getting official documentation of each incident that can support later action if escalation continues. Instead of being frustrated when police can't or won't act on preliminary behaviors, you understand that their hands are often tied by legal constraints and resource limitations. The second reality is that law enforcement response is heavily influenced by how you present the situation and what evidence you can provide. Police officers encounter many calls that don't result in action, either because the situation doesn't clearly involve criminal activity, or because there's insufficient evidence to support the complainant's description of events. How you communicate about what's happening significantly impacts whether your concerns are taken seriously and whether documentation and investigation occur. Effective communication with law enforcement includes being factual and specific rather than emotional or speculative, providing dates, times, and detailed descriptions of exactly what occurred, presenting evidence such as photographs, videos, or other documentation, articulating the pattern rather than just the most recent incident, and demonstrating that you're taking reasonable measures to protect yourself. This doesn't mean you can't express that you're frightened or concerned. But leading with emotion, rather than facts, tends to reduce credibility with officers who deal daily with people in crisis. The third reality is that law enforcement has limited resources and must prioritize based on severity and immediacy of threat. Property harassment and intimidation, while serious to those experiencing it, typically gets lower priority than violent crimes in progress, active threats to life, or other emergency situations. This means that response times may be slow, that follow-up investigation may be minimal, and that you may need to be persistent in order to get adequate attention to your situation. Understanding this priority system helps you be strategic about when and how you contact police. Calling during acute incidents when behavior is obviously threatening or criminal is more likely to generate meaningful response than calling after the fact to report something that occurred hours or days ago. Being able to say that someone is currently on your property, currently engaging in threatening behavior, or currently attempting to break in will generate faster response than reporting historical patterns of concern. Fourth reality, and this is particularly important for harassment and stalking scenarios, is that legal standards for intervention are often higher than what seems reasonable to victims. Harassment and stalking laws typically require repeated behavior that serves no legitimate purpose, and that would cause a reasonable person to feel frightened or distressed. Proving these elements can be challenging, especially in the early stages of a pattern. The behavior may be repeated, but each incident might seem minor. The purpose might be ambiguous. The standard of what a reasonable person would feel can be interpreted narrowly. This means that police may legitimately be unable to take action even when you're clearly being targeted, not because they don't believe you or don't take it seriously, but because the legal standard for the specific charges or interventions you're seeking hasn't been met yet. Understanding this helps you focus on building the documentation and evidence that will eventually meet those standards, rather than being frustrated that action isn't immediate. The fifth reality is that protective orders and other legal interventions have significant limitations in their effectiveness. While protective orders can be valuable tools and should absolutely be pursued when appropriate, they're not magic shields. They require that the harasser be identified and locatable. They rely on the harasser's willingness to comply or fear of consequences for noncompliance. They can sometimes escalate rather than de-escalate situations if the harasser is motivated by power and control, rather than by rational cost-benefit calculation. Understanding the limitations of formal legal protections means you don't rely solely on them for your safety. A protective order is one tool among many, not a complete solution. It may be most valuable for the official documentation it creates and for the legal consequences it enables if violation occurs, rather than for its direct deterrent effect on the harasser's behavior. Being realistic about this helps you maintain other protective measures, even after formal legal interventions are in place. The sixth reality is that the experience of dealing with law enforcement can itself be traumatic or frustrating for victims, and this secondary trauma can compound the primary trauma of being targeted. Being questioned skeptically, having to repeatedly explain your situation, having concerns minimized or dismissed, being made to feel like you're overreacting or wasting police time. All of these experiences are unfortunately common, and all of them add to the psychological burden of being victimized. Preparing yourself for this possibility helps reduce its impact. Knowing in advance that you may not be believed immediately, that you may need to be persistent, that you may encounter officers who don't take the situation seriously, helps you maintain resolve and continue seeking help rather than giving up after initial negative experiences. It also helps you recognize that how you're